Welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany and welcome to my September wrap-up. So I could do a whole summer book bingo wrap-up, but I'm not going to do that because I, at the point of this video coming out, have already had a live show wrapping up my summer book bingo and announcing the winner of the giveaway for summer book bingo. So I will link that so that way if you missed that, because if I'm calculating this correctly, this video should be coming out the day after that live. I want to make sure that you see that, especially in case you were entered, but I'm not really going to be going over summer book bingo details here, even though this is the last of the summer book bingo months with August. But I am going to talk about the books that I read. I've been doing weekly reading vlogs all throughout the entirety of this summer, so I'm not going to be sharing any in-depth thoughts on the books that I read here. Instead, I'll try to link some reading vlogs below if you're interested in those so you can hear more in-depth thoughts. But I'm just going to be ranking them from my least favorite book that I read this month all the way up to my favorites. So at the bottom of the pile is Scaramouche by Raphael Sabatini. I read this with Katie from Paperbacks and Ponytails, and I still enjoyed this book. I gave it 3 stars, so it's a decent rating month when the bottom of the pile is 3 stars. That's still really good. So it's not like this was a bad book at all. I just had some difficulty in feeling attached to the main character. The main character's name is Andre Louis, and at the beginning of the book, his friend is essentially murdered. He's provoked into a duel because of beliefs that he has, and it's a duel that the other person knows that he certainly couldn't win, and it was their way of trying to silence his friend's voice. And so Andre Louis decides, in honor of his dead friend, he's going to perpetuate these beliefs that his friend was perpetuating, but he doesn't believe them himself. And so there was just a lot of insincerity, and once he starts believing anything or feeling anything at all, he still is kind of promoting this flippancy to the world because he doesn't want them to know how he feels. He's hiding himself away, so to speak. But as a result of that, I didn't really feel connected or attached to him. So I kind of wasn't invested in most of the storyline, except when he's with the acting troupe. I really, really liked that whole section. I think that was part 2 of the book. So I liked the middle part of the book, didn't really care about the beginning or the end, but it was so fun to read it with Katie because Katie grew up watching the movie, and so she had some comparisons, and I think maybe as a result of her growing up with the movie, maybe she connected with it a little bit more than I did, but I had never heard of this until she recommended that we read it because it's been sitting on her shelves for forever. So yeah, it was decent. It was fine. It just wasn't outstanding, and I didn't feel connected to it. It felt way more plot driven, and I tend to be more of a character driven reader. Next up is Winter in Sokjo, which I actually did not vlog this one because this was the week I was sick, and so I didn't talk about this at all, I don't think. I read this with Una, Stephanie, and Christy, and it was so enjoyable to read with them. And I think I gave this one also 3 or 3.5 stars, not because it was bad. It's just, it was difficult at times to kind of connect to some of what was going on just because of the way that was written. And I really felt like it was kind of missing something, but there was some amazingly beautiful writing, even though the writing I would say as a whole is very sparse. But I think that really communicated the barrenness of wintertime in Sokjo. It communicated, they are so close to the border of North Korea, and so there's talk of the Korean War, and there's talk of all these things. And it's just really interesting, the ideas that the author is exploring in this, because we're following a young girl who is half French and half Korean, and this is translated, I think, from the French. Maybe it's translated from Korean. I'm not really sure actually which one it's translated from, because the author herself is also half French and half Korean. So there's just a really interesting parallel there. And she's trying to figure out who she is and where she belongs and which side of herself she identifies with the most. So it's really a journey of discovery for her. There is some content in here, I'm just going to throw that out here as a warning, that normally in books I would probably steer away from. But it was a very weird the way some of those scenes were just kind of thrown in there, and they felt very disconnected for me. And so there were parts of it as a whole that the story felt a bit disconnected for me. I loved the ending. I thought the ending was really meaningful, and there's a larger discussion to be had about using people to learn about their culture and cultural appropriation and seeing people in their cultural as actual people instead of seeing them as a resource or a means to an end. Next up on this list is Apothecary Diaries Volume 2. So I read Volume 1 earlier this summer, and I really like this series a lot. It's essentially about a girl who is trained to be an apothecary, but then she ends up being sold into slavery, and she ends up working at the palace and ends up saving someone's life because she recognizes that the symptoms are poison when they thought it was like a curse or something like that. Because she's trained as an apothecary, she knows what's going on. And so it's really fun. There's a lot of humor in it and a lot of great interactions. And I love Mau Mau, the main character. I love her so much. Next up on this ranking is Cry the Beloved Country by Alan Patton, or maybe it's Peyton. Tia and I still don't know. We read this together. This is a book that takes place in South Africa, and it is examining racial tensions and all of that kind of stuff. It was written in the 40s, and it's often assigned as reading to kids in high school, and so it has a lot of significance in literary circles, I think, but it was kind of a difficult read, and for a really long time I couldn't really understand why this book was considered so impactful as it was, because the writing itself felt very disconnected at times, and it drove me nuts how he wrote dialogue. I shared this in vlogs, so if you've seen those, you already know I've showed you, but like the dialogue is like this. There's no quotation marks, and it just feels very sparse at times, and so sometimes it's hard to intuit the emotion that phrases are being said with. But then there are moments where he would write the most beautiful descriptions of scenery or things like that, and I think that that is really where his writing shines, is in his descriptions. And the end of this book was so beautiful, so beautiful, and that's when I kind of saw like, okay, this is why this is considered a classic. But I wish that the whole of the book had been written in the style that the end was, because it wasn't. And it almost feels like multiple people wrote this book. Okay, everything from this point forward, I loved so much. I think the only one that wasn't 5 stars out of the next books that I'm gonna talk about is Attack on Titan Volume 2, but that's like 4.5. Like, it's still really, really high. So I read the first volume last month when I was reading like RM for a week. I read the first volume of Attack on Titan, and I really kind of struggled with it a little bit, even though I enjoyed it, because I was not prepared for the horror element of it, because I thought it was just like an action adventure manga, and it's not. There's definitely a strong horror element to it, and it's pretty violent at times. But I didn't want to give up on it because so many people have said it was so good, and I thought maybe part of the reason I struggled with it is because I wasn't mentally prepared for what was going to be in it. And so Christy Lewis and I decided we wanted to read Volume 2 together, and we both really, really loved it and want to continue on with the series. So I'm really, really enjoying Attack on Titan. Okay, everything from this point forward is 5 stars. So we're going to start with The Faithful Spy by Dawn Hendricks. I read this with Chantel Reads All Day for her book club, and I'll link the live for that in case you want to watch that discussion. This was a really, really enjoyable read. This is a graphic biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, and it's not quite like a graphic novel. It has like panels that look like graphic novels and even pages that look like graphic novels, like this one right here. But then there's pages where there's a lot of text on it, and then there's pages that kind of have more of an infographic style. I'm trying to find one of those, like this one right here. So it's really a mix of all of those things, but I really enjoyed this one. I learned so much in this book, not just about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, but also about World War II and Hitler's rise to power, and kind of the state of people who were really bystanders and didn't really stand up to Hitler in the way that Bonhoeffer did. There's a quote in here from Martin Niemöller that says, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And so there's definitely some exploration of why good people just stood by, and like how that impacted Germany, obviously, and why there were some people who were totally swayed by Hitler. And I really appreciated that. And also Dietrich Bonhoeffer's kind of moral quandary of being a spy and trying to assassinate a leader, and the moral ethics of that. And I appreciated so much about this book, and I was just so fascinated. Next up, I have a sci-fi short story by Ray Bradbury. It is included in his Martian Chronicles, but it was originally published on its own, and it's called There Will Come Soft Rains. And I loved this. This was so good. The title is actually based on a Sarah Teasdale poem, which is also quoted in the story. And it is just, I love Bradbury's writing so much, and I can't believe that I've read almost nothing by him. Like, I've never read Fahrenheit 451. I don't know why, but I haven't. And last summer I read The Sound of Thunder, and it was one of my favorite things that I read last summer, even though that's a short story. And this is amazing, and I just absolutely loved it. And I need to read more Ray Bradbury. I have so much of his work, and I still haven't read it. So I loved this. This is really about technology versus nature, and whether or not nature even needs mankind. And it is just really interesting. It follows a house, and a smart house, which is really interesting because it's written in the 50s, and there are some things that houses can do now that happen in the story, and some things that they can't. But it was just really interesting because the smart house is the only house standing in this city, and it's still going through the motions of this is what you do to take care of the house, this is what you do to take care of the people in the house every day, and it's continuing that even though there are no people living inside of it. And so it's so interesting. I love Bradbury's idea exploration in this, even though it was very haunting. Last two books, they are tied probably, I think, because they're very different, but they both came at a time where it was like what my heart needed, and I didn't even know what it needed. The first one is The Saturdays by Elizabeth Enright. This was a Patreon group read, which was super fun because we chose a classic middle grade, so that way my daughter could join in this month for her birthday, and that was just really fun to have her on there sharing her thoughts. She actually came up with some discussion questions as well, which was super fun. So this is the first of a quartet following 4 siblings, and they are very discontent on a rainy Saturday, and they decide in future Saturdays they are going to pool their allowance money so that each of them can do something really cool that they're not able to do otherwise. And then the next week the allowance will go to the next child, and so on and so on. And so it's following each of their adventures. Each chapter is a Saturday. That's why it's called The Saturdays. And this was just delightful. It was so funny at times. It was so insightful at times. This is the second Elizabeth Enright I've read. The other one was Thimble Summer, which I read a couple of summers ago with Claire. And Elizabeth Enright writes childhood just so perfectly. Like, there's so many things that she'll write and I'll be like, oh my gosh, I did that as a kid. I felt that way as a kid. And so I love her writing so much. There's, I think, 3 more books in this series. Yes, I said it was a quartet. 3 more books in this series, and Claire and I want to keep reading them. The last book, maybe this is my favorite book. I know I said the last 2 are tied because I think it depends on the day. The last book, easy 5-star. A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. This is the first in the Lady Trent's memoir series. And oh my word, this is so good. And I had really high expectations because people told me it's so good. It's like Jane Austen, but with dragons. And I was like, how can you go wrong with that? I don't think that you can. But yet there's always this part of me that's afraid to have too high of expectations. But I was like, I think I'm gonna love this. And this actually won for my in-person book club. We decided to read a fantasy in the month of August, and this is the one that got chosen. And I was so excited. It's so good, you guys. It's so good. So it follows a girl, and she loves science, and she is obsessed with dragons, and she's living in a time where it is not socially acceptable for women to be in scientific fields, and she really wants to study dragons. And so dragons play much more of a scientific role in this story than they do a fantastical one. Like, yes, they're fantastical creatures, but it's not this big like magical, we're trying to ride the dragons, we can communicate with the dragons, we're harnessing their magical power. It's not like that. So it's very different from a lot of other fantastical dragon stories. And there's like some really amazing like illustrations in here as well, which I had no idea there was going to be illustrations before I read it. These are drawings from like her naturalist journals and stuff, and it just is such a great book. I loved it so much, and I'm so glad it's a series because that means I can keep reading them. I could see this being a book or a series that I continue to come back for a comfort read because it was so great. I can't even tell you how much I loved it. I was so surprised that it was like it exceeded all of my really high expectations, is what I'm trying to say. This is just turning into a gush fest about how much I loved it, but it's true. I really loved it. So I don't know future books I haven't read yet, so maybe this will not be a series that I'm just like, oh my gosh, obsessed with and I want to read over and over and over again. But book one is setting the bar really high, so I hope that the rest of the series continues to be just as enjoyable and lovely as this one. There you have it. There's my wrap up for the month of August. I really enjoyed so much of what I read this month. Like I said, like my 2 lowest books were like in the 3-star range, which is really good. I actually had 4 or 5 stars and then some that were like really high 4 stars as well. So this was a really good reading month, and I'm so happy that I read the things that I did. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. How was your August reading? I hope that you had as good of a reading month as I did, and I would love it if you would share what your favorites were that you read in the month of August. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.